Okay, I think we've got most of the people we're expecting now, so I'll probably crack on, make a start. So, welcome everyone to this session of Beers of Engineers. There's myself, Andy Rock, Solution Architect from Integrity 360. We just move the slide on. We've got Andy Dreyer from Varonis, and we've got Rob Dunn from Siren Breweries. So, just a quick agenda for this session. Obviously, we've got introductions now. We're going to launch straight into it and have a beer just to get everything nice and lubricated and get everyone comfortable. Andy is going to just talk through his slides, which are around collaboration and Microsoft and Teams and the importance of data security there within. We'll have another break midway through that. And then since we've covered the challenges there, we'll talk about actually what can businesses do to address these challenges. Follow that up with another beer, obviously, and then we'll have a Q&A for anyone who's got any questions. So if you have got any questions, everyone is currently muted. If you can just put them into the Q&A box and we'll address them all at the end, if that's okay. So just to kick it off, we started Beers of Engineers a few years ago with the pandemic. Obviously, we were restricted into being able to actually go out and mingle and meet customers face to face. And I know I'm personally a little bit tired of hearing about the pandemic in presentations like this, but it has been an absolute catalyst, a complete paradigm shift in the way people are working. Even now, working patterns haven't got back to the way they were pre-pandemic. Really, they're not going to. With the advent of the new collaboration technologies, the kind of improvement of just internet speeds in general around the country, and then just people have realised actually working from home is viable. It is a recognised working pattern. You know, I don't think we're going to go back to the way before. And even for people who are in the office, we're still using the same collaboration tools just to get through our working day. Now, with that brings a lot of technical challenges for the people on the call. We've no longer got a kind of central reserve of data where we can easily, have enforcement points for data going in and out. So we're going to talk through those particular challenges and actually how can we address those challenges. But as promised, let's kick off with Rob. Rob comes from Siren Craft Brewery. I'll hand over to you, Rob.
Fantastic, thank you very much, Andy. Yes, so yeah, Siren Craft Brewery, a small little brewery, well, getting bigger, based down in Finch Hampstead. If anyone's local, feel free to come along. We're open most days for all your beery goodness. But I thought I'd kick us off with a nice light one to start with. This can Pastel Pils. So it's our gluten-free Pilsner, which, a little bit rare these days, but it's quite nice to have something a bit more drinkable for anyone with celiacs, for example. And 100%, I hope they're all nice and fresh out the fridge. But it's a lovely, crisp, refreshing beer. Probably a good one to start off with. We don't want to be going too heavy. Otherwise, I reckon there might be a couple of head to desks later on. But yeah, we call it our sort of Italian style Pilsner. It was our first beer we ever made using our sort of new water purification process, where we basically adjust water profiles of the beer that we want. Because depending on what profile you've got, it really affects the overall kind of base for your beer and the kind of mouthfeel and a flavour set you end up with. And we call it Italian style because we copied the water profiles from Rome to get that really nice, crisp, lagery taste. Harder water is probably better for certain things like stouts, which sadly we don't have one on today. But we've got a couple of nice, really punchy ones that we'll get onto later. But that's something just to keep you ticking over for a little bit. I'm sure will come back to me later on. But thank you very much, guys.
So I'll just stop sharing, Andy, and you can take over.
Brilliant. I'll dive straight in. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, brilliant. And hopefully you should see a screen that's come up that says The Secret Life of Microsoft Teams. Has that appeared okay?
All good.
Brilliant. Excellent. Well, good afternoon, everyone. So my name's Andy Dreyer. I'm a sales engineer here at Varonis. And in this session today, we're going to be talking about the secret life of Microsoft Teams. And we're going to be looking at essentially what really happens behind the scenes when your users are sharing data, collaborating on projects, working together using the 365 platform. So we'll be looking at a world where sharing isn't necessarily caring, but looking at some of the problems that businesses face when using Microsoft Teams, but more importantly, talk about how businesses can approach those, understand them, and of course, resolve those problems as well. So I've got about 35 minutes of content that I'm going to go through today before we have another beer break. And as mentioned, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A and we will jump onto those at the end of the session. So diving straight in, I just want to have a quick discussion about what drives our vision here at Varonis, why we believe data is so important. And the thing is that data is constantly changing. Data is increasing in organizations and data is being stored in more and more locations. And when data is expanding, being stored in lots of different places, often managed by different people within the organization, it can be very difficult for organizations to answer very crucial questions about their data. First and foremost, where is their most sensitive data? The data their business runs on, the data that the bad guys want to get to. Where is that data across all of those different platforms? How much data is there? And understanding where that sensitive data actually exists across all of those different places. But of course, understanding sensitive data here is what's really important, because lots of organizations know that they have sensitive data. But the main thing here is that data at risk? Is that data potentially exposed to too many people within the organization when it just shouldn't be? Is that sensitive data potentially exposed to people outside of the organization that shouldn't have access to it? And these are questions that organizations really struggle to answer, certainly as that data increases in volume. But of course, the reason that people want to know this is because they actually want to fix it. If they know they've got sensitive data that is exposed to way too many people, they want to reduce that risk. But how can they effectively do that without risking causing more problems, without breaking things and preventing people accessing that data? So these can be really difficult questions to answer. But when we think about breaches and threat detection and response, a lot of organizations really struggle with understanding how their users actually use their sensitive data, how service accounts are using that data, and how applications are using it. And if organizations don't know what's normal for their users and they don't understand what's normal for applications using data, it's very difficult for them to understand what's abnormal and identify threats early. And of course, that's particularly prevalent when you think about things like advanced persistent threats and ransomware, when attackers are commonly in the environment for long periods of time. And then finally, there is, of course, the compliance side of things. And when you think about it, how can you ever say as a business that you are compliant if firstly, you don't understand where your sensitive data is, like GDPR, you don't understand whether the right people have access to it, and you don't understand how data is used within your environment? It's very hard to tick that box and to be able to say you're compliant without understanding those crucial things. And of course, if somebody calls your business and says, right, I want to give you a DSAR, a data subject access request, I want to know what data you have on me, and I want you to delete it, without that understanding of the data, it's tremendously difficult to answer those questions. So these are all examples of questions that organizations struggle with surrounding their data. And of course, questions that organizations really need to have a handle on. And of course, CISOs need to have a handle on as well. So this brings me nicely on to Microsoft 365. So what's up with Microsoft 365? Well, I'm sure that everyone on this call in one way or another uses 365, and it's not a surprise. 365 really does make work easy, or projects easy for organizations, because it's allowing people to very quickly collaborate on projects, to share data between themselves, and essentially to be far more productive and to get things done. But of course, with that great power comes great responsibility. And the problem is that users within 365 essentially have the ability to share data with whoever they want to within the business, and sometimes outside the business as well. And that's happening completely under the radar of the IT team. And that complexity, when you're sharing data, when you're doing all of those things, is completely hidden from the user, and it's completely hidden from IT. And that's where the problems can really start to occur. because your users are sharing data, it's pretty much impossible to say, well, who actually has access to this sensitive data that my users can share around the infrastructure? And the problem is that data so frequently with 365 ends up being exposed either to the wrong people internally, to too many people internally, or even to people outside of the organization. And for IT teams, it's just really difficult to say, well, who can access that data and work out who is actually accessing what. So what we'll do first and foremost is have a quick look at how collaboration works within Office 365 or Microsoft 365. And I think the first thing when we're talking about Microsoft Teams, where you're sharing data and collaborating, is that Microsoft Teams itself isn't a data store. We hear a lot of the time people say, you know, that data is stored in Teams. Well, Teams itself isn't a place where you store data. Teams is using an underlying infrastructure to essentially support that and allow it to store data. So, for example, if you are sending emails through Microsoft Teams, you are using Exchange Online. You're using the mailboxes and the users that exist within there. In the same way, the vast majority of users, the vast majority of groups that exist within Microsoft Teams exist within Azure Active Directory. So all of those users are essentially predefined users that already exist in Azure within your environment. Now, when it comes down to personal files, data you might just be sharing between one another, that data is stored within Microsoft OneDrive. And when we think about the collaboration data, when you're actually creating big teams, that data you're putting in Microsoft Teams is going directly into SharePoint Online. So it's important to understand that first and foremost. You're never storing data in Teams. When you are putting data in those Microsoft Teams channels, essentially they're being stored in SharePoint Online or it's being stored in OneDrive. And that is where the problem can really start to occur. Data is being stored in different locations with different permissions, and it can be very hard to keep on top of that. So I think a good way to explain how these problems can very quickly unfold is to put this into an example. So we're going to have a team here that exists within an organization, and this is a finance team. So this finance team within an organization, they need to collaborate on projects, talk about all things finance. So the obvious thing to do is to create a team within Microsoft Teams in order to allow them to communicate. So you can see Amelia there, the finance manager. She creates the team with her different members within it, Linda, James, William, and Zoe. But Amelia is also aware that she often needs to speak to somebody in HR, in this case, Sandra. And that on top of that, there's also an external lawyer, someone completely separate to the organization, who is the external legal counsel. And that person is called Margaret. So Amelia decides to create a Microsoft team that has all of these individuals in it, the people in the finance team, but also the HR and external legal counsel as well. So that is exactly what happens. The first thing that will happen here is Amelia creates that team, and she adds all of those users in, the members that are in her team itself, but also that external counsel and the HR head as well. Now, Amelia has been able to do that without the IT team having to do anything. It's Amelia that has said, we are the people that need to communicate. So she has created that team accordingly. And you'll notice just at the top there that she's made somebody else in her team, Zoe, also an owner of this particular Microsoft team as well. So the team is now created. So the next thing that happens is users start to collaborate using this team and maybe share sensitive data. So Linda, who's in that team, decides, well, I need to collaborate with certain members of the finance organization, and I need to collaborate with James and William. So I'm going to use this Microsoft team that's just been created, and I'm going to create a channel in there and upload an Excel file called employee bonuses. And just so we're clear on particular terms here, a channel can be seen as something a user can create in a Microsoft team. And a channel is usually like a micro project area or a particular place of work within that team. So Linda has created that bonuses channel in that team, and she's put that sensitive document with a load of PII in there. So fairly simple. That's what the team is there for. Now, finally, somebody within that team, in this case, James, decides, well, there's actually somebody in the HR team that I want to share this new bonuses document with. So James shares that document with Emma, the HR manager. And an important thing just to point out here is note that Emma is not a member of that team that was just created. She's somebody else, admittedly still within the business, but she is not within that Microsoft team. And this is something we see all the time, people just having access to data and saying, right, well, I need to share that with someone. And that's what James has done here. Now, finally, in this example, we have William, who's also in that finance team, and he just decides to create a one-on-one chat with Margaret. He's not using the team. He just decides, I need to speak to Margaret, our external legal counsel, and he shares a document, employee agreements, with that external legal counsel. And that is the example. That's what everyone has done within that organization. And these are all things that, in this case, were completely legitimate. A team was created by Amelia for the finance team to collaborate with each other. A member of that team decided to share a sensitive document with someone in HR. And we also saw that William created a one-on-one chat with somebody outside the business, all legitimate and all allowed by the IT team within this organization. So let's have a look at that example and how that collaboration can very quickly turn into chaos. Well, firstly, when this team was created, Amelia earmarked another member of the team, Zoe, as a co-owner of that group. Now, in making her a co-owner of that particular Microsoft team that was just created, it means that she's essentially become an administrator for a security group in Azure Active Directory, and she's become an administrator who can actually add and remove people from that particular group. Now, Zoe can add whoever she wants to that team. She could remove whoever she wants to for that team. But Zoe might not have any security knowledge, but she has been given essentially a role that allows her to administer Azure Active Directory group. So she's been given some privileges that she didn't even know that she had. So that is a problem in itself. But we also know that Linda very legitimately decided to create a channel in that Microsoft team, and she uploaded a PII document. And that was only for specific people in her team, but she might not realize that there's people outside of the organization or outside of her team, such as Sandra, and also Margaret, the external counsel, that now has access to that particular file when she only wanted specific people inside that group to actually see that. So people outside of the organization have suddenly got access to bonus information that they don't need. Now, James, as another part of this example, who's a member of that Microsoft team, he decided that he wanted to share that Excel document with all the PII in it to a member of the HR team called Emma. And she is not part of that Microsoft team. Now, the thing about this is that nobody knows other than James that he has shared that very sensitive document with somebody outside of that Microsoft team. And because he sent her a link to that particular document, that's not going to show in any entitlement review or any review of her access. So in essence, people outside the team have got access to this data, and it's only James that knows about this. So you can start to see how just by some very simple, legitimate actions, we've got data being shared potentially with people outside of the organization, people outside of the finance team, and it's very hard to understand who that data is actually shared with. So finally, in the example, we had William, if you remember, and William did a one-on-one share with the external legal counsel. And he did that himself. He did it completely outside of that specific Microsoft team. And there is that question, well, where was that file stored? Who can actually access it? Is it just Margaret? Is it just William? And where does that file go when that chat ends? These can be very difficult questions to answer, and we'll come back to the answers of that in just a moment. So this shows a particular problem, and it's something that we see all the time with Microsoft Teams, and that is the fact that control is completely outside of IT's hands. When we think about all of those actions that took place, they weren't malicious actions, they weren't intentionally oversharing data, but the situation we have is that someone has created a team with people outside of the organization. Data has been put into that team where people outside of the organization shouldn't necessarily have it. And we've seen that when users decide to then share that data with other people in the organization, that's not tracked. It's not actually known to that team that that has actually happened. And it sounds like I'm probably knocking Microsoft Teams here, and I'm not trying to do that. The thing is that there's no privacy by design. It's just not the way the system was designed to work. So what that basically means is very quickly, data is overexposed internally, sometimes to too many people, and even worse, can often be shared externally. And when that is very sensitive, regulated data, that becomes a problem very quickly. So we've talked about that particular problem and that particular example, but what does that actually look like under the hood? Why is this actually a problem? Why is it so hard to track? Well, let's have a look at what really happens when you create a team. So in this particular example, when someone created that new Microsoft team, a bunch of groups will have been created in 365. And in turn, those groups will have also been created as subgroups in Azure Active Directory. So there, straight away, creating a team basically means you are creating security groups within the business's Azure Active Directory infrastructure. Now, what's also happening there is a SharePoint Online site is created. So just like your existing SharePoint Online sites you might have, like finance, HR, when you create a new team, a new SharePoint site is created as well. And beyond that, various mailboxes and calendars and bits and pieces will be created in Exchange Online as well. So lots of things are being created behind the scenes when you create this team with new permissions and new levels of access. And again, this is all taking place outside of IT's knowledge. So let's have a look at where the data is actually stored. So I just said a moment ago that when you create a new Microsoft team, a new SharePoint Online site is created. Now, like we saw in the example earlier, if someone creates a new channel, like the bonuses channel, that will create a folder in that SharePoint Online site. So any files that then get stored in that team's in that channel are going to be stored within Microsoft Teams. And it's the same with those emails. They're going to go into those documents folders within Microsoft Teams in that SharePoint site. Now, if we then have a look at private channels are kind of similar to standard channels, but the difference between private channels and standard channels is that a private channel, someone actually has to say, I want to add people to this group. They can't just get to them by default. So if users create private channels in Microsoft Teams, again, that's going to create a new SharePoint Online site. It's going to create folders with files underneath it if files are shared in that. So what you're able to see here is that in creating a Microsoft team, you're creating SharePoint Online sites. When you're sharing files in those teams, you are storing those files within SharePoint. And permissions are being created straight away as a result of that. And as you can see, overexposure can happen very quickly. And the last piece of this is actually the OneDrive side of things. So if you are having one-on-one chats, for example, and you're sharing documents, pieces of information in those chats, that data is going into those users' OneDrive locations. So lots of data that isn't staying in Teams, it's being put in SharePoint Online and it's being put in OneDrive. And this is how things can get out of control very quickly because there's data in places that businesses didn't expect with permissions that IT teams didn't set themselves. So it begs the question, well, can IT actually see anything? If all of the users are doing this within Teams, there's things going on in Azure, can the IT team actually get visibility of this at all? Well, let's have a look at that. So we saw how Emma earlier was outside of that Microsoft team, but a member of the team decided to share data with her. So can we actually see Emma in Azure Active Directory? We can see the team that was created, and we can see the members of that team, including the legal counsel, including the HR manager. but we can't see Emma in there. So Azure AD is not telling us that Emma has access to these particular documents. She's not in in Azure AD. So what we can then do is jump over to Microsoft Teams. Can we see Emma in the Teams view? And again, all we can see is the users that were added to that team when Amelia created this team in the first place. We can't see Emma in there. We can only see the people that were in there when the team was created. So IT have this lack of visibility by looking in Azure AD and looking in Microsoft Teams. So the question is there anywhere else that they can look to work out who actually has access to this data? Well, let's have a look at that. So another place that you could look is to go directly into SharePoint Online itself and actually navigate specifically to the location. So we can see the team, we can see the SharePoint Online site, the documents folder, and the bonuses channel. And we can see that employee bonuses file. And if we have a look at who has access, for the first time, we can see Emma from HR on the right-hand side. We've had to go into SharePoint Online to find this. Now, bear in mind, we needed pre-knowledge of the fact that there was a file, a sensitive file here. So we've had to find this kind of on a whim and know that this file existed in advance. But we can come here and we can see Emma has access. But what's interesting is we can't see who else has access. We can see Emma does, and we can then see a number of groups within SharePoint Online. But we can't see any of those people that are in the team itself. We can't see Amelia. We can't see Zoe. We can't see the external legal counsel. So we can look at some advanced views here and see if this is going to tell us any more. And again, we can see the individual groups and we can click into them to determine, well, who can actually access this. But again, notice that Emma isn't there. Notice that none of the people in the team are there. And we've got that lack of visibility. So the only way that we can actually see if Emma's here is to click on the manage links. And we can see again that Emma from HR has access to this data. But again, we don't really know what she can do with this data. And we've had to really drill down quite heavily into different locations to work out what actually, who actually has access to this file. And this is just one SharePoint site. This is one Microsoft Teams. If you scale this out to the hundreds of teams that exist within organizations, this becomes unmanageable very quickly. So what have we learned here? Well, firstly, there's no clear visibility. Emma and Chris, who we saw on the previous screen, we saw in SharePoint Online that they had access, but we had to drill in specifically to the folder. We needed to know where that was in advance. And it was only then that we could see Emma and that we could see Chris that had access to this particular data. But at the same time, the team members are only visible in Azure Active Directory and they're only visible in Teams. So there's a lot of having to join the dots here using different consoles to simply answer the question, who has access to that sensitive document? And that's just one team. That is just one document out of all of those that would be used within an organization. So for the eagle-eyed amongst you, you'll probably see that we introduced a new person here along the way called Chris Legal. So who is Chris? You know, how did he get into this? How's he suddenly involved in this example? Well, another way that you can very easily share data within Teams and SharePoint Online is to actually go into SharePoint itself, find the data you want to share and actually share it out. And that's exactly what's happened here. Data has been shared with a user called Chris Legal by someone going directly into SharePoint and sharing that data out. So it's another way that data can easily be shared over and above doing that in Teams. Now, the problem is that, of course, E5 offers all kinds of tools to try and help with this, but it doesn't give that information. Being able to answer those questions, who can access that data? More importantly, who can access that sensitive data is incredibly difficult. And when you think about the scale of this problem, in 365, users, if they have privileges, can share out entire sites in SharePoint Online. They can share out folders. They can share out files. Now, from an IT perspective, you could say, right, well, let's just stop collaboration. Let's lock this down. But the problem here is that if you block all sharing, users are going to find new ways to try and get data shared around the business. And that causes a shadow IT problem that can be even more difficult to track. Now, further to that, you might say, well, let's block it, but for specific users can share data. But the problem there again is suddenly that becomes confusing. You've got lists to maintain. You've got to determine, should those people still be part of that list? Who can do what? And you're not solving a problem there. In many ways, you're creating more of a problem. So it can be very difficult to keep a handle on this with the native controls that Microsoft provide in SharePoint and OneDrive. Now, if we move away from 365 just for a moment, this used to be a lot easier when they were just on-prem file systems, because in those days, file shares were set up by IT, and it was IT that would control that. So IT would create a share. IT would then decide who actually needs access and would create security groups with specific members. They'd then apply those to those particular shares, to those particular folders. Now, don't get me wrong, it wasn't flawless. There was still problems with privilege, but it was harder for users to violate least privilege. And these, of course, are still in use today. We see lots of organizations that have hybrid environments, and they're keeping on-prem for good reasons. But of course, moving to 365 just makes this a lot more difficult. And the reason for that is because it's your users who are now sharing data. It's not IT making those decisions. And when you think about what users can share, they can share SharePoint sites, team sites. They can create links to folders, links to files, share potentially a lot of data. And in terms of who they could share that with, they would have the ability to potentially share data to every user within the organization, potentially to users outside the organization, so guests and external users. And one we're seeing a lot of is anyone on the internet with a link, where essentially a link is created. And if that link is sent out, anyone outside the organization or inside the organization can click that link, access the data without having to authenticate whatsoever. So there's lots of potential sharing concerns by your users being able to control sharing. And in terms of how they can do it in individual apps like Excel, Word, PowerPoint. They can do it in Explorer, or they could do it within SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams as well. So it becomes very, very difficult to track. So just to come back to the summary here, well, who can actually access this Teams data? It really does come down to who you ask. The problem here is that often it's users that are sharing data, and it's only them that knows that they have actually shared it. We've seen that we have a problem in terms of Azure AD and Teams will show some users as being members of these groups, but won't in SharePoint Online, and vice versa. And we've also seen how users who don't have any security skills can very easily be designated as co-owners as security groups. And all of these links that have been created, these shareable links and collaboration links, they aren't visible in Teams or Azure AD. They're only visible when you're in SharePoint Online, when you have prior knowledge of that particular information. So what this basically means is that it's very hard for IT teams to answer that question and actually see who has access to the sensitive resources within the business. Where are the biggest examples of sensitive data within my organization? These questions are hard to answer. And without that, you can't prioritize risk. If you want to take action, if you want to fix these problems, you don't have the information to prioritize your efforts or deal with the crocodile closest to the boat, which I always like to say with regards to these kind of things. And that, of course, makes compliance a real problem when you require things like privacy by design. And it means you can't limit your attack surface and your blast radius. And finally, if you're not tracking data that's moving around the infrastructure, it's very difficult to detect abnormal behavior, especially on sensitive data. So now think about this in the scale of an organization's 365 environment. We've talked about some of the problems. We've talked about that lack of visibility. But think about an organization's or your own 365 environment here. Now at Varonis, we always perform quarterly business reviews with all of our customers to make sure that we constantly know what their aims and objectives are and make sure that they are meeting their goals. And a standard kind of slide that we would show in this is showing them how much on-premise data they've got, how much Microsoft 365 data that they've got. And in this example here, you'll see that this particular customer has 26.3 terabytes of data on-premise, which is, not uncommon, and that there's 53 million individual permissions that govern that data. And when you think about that, 53 million permissions that are essentially controlling access to all of these files, all of these folders, all these users, how can you ever understand what 53 million permissions means in terms of risk and who actually has access? Without some kind of tooling, it's very hard to answer those questions. But of course, in the context of what we're talking about today, this particular customer had far less data within their Microsoft 365 environment, but their permissions were pretty much 3 times the amount of what they have on-prem. And again, that comes down to collaboration. Every time a team is being created, permissions are being created. When private channels are being created, new sites and permissions are being created. When files are being dropped in there, new permissions are being created. So it can get out of hand so quickly and can become really difficult for organizations to keep a handle on. So of course, what happens in the background is that chaos builds up over time, and it can be really pretty much impossible for organizations to contain. So what we're going to do shortly is go on to how we can solve these problems with using Varonis and what organizations can do to get a handle on this. But before we do that, I'm going to stop talking and it's time to move on to another beer. So I'll hand over to you, Rob.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Andy. Excellent. Well, I was thinking perhaps if everyone's finished with that lovely pastel pills, we might move on to a nice bigger can. Something to get those taste buds tingling. I think we'll probably go for actually First Impressions, carry on the lager train. So First Impressions was a beer that we created for Oktoberfest this year, actually, which we had a fantastic event of down at the Tap Yard. It was manic, but my God, was it good. It's always nice to get as many people down as drinking as possible. And I think lager is just such a good way of doing that because it's a beer that everyone really enjoys and can get behind, and it's a good sort of jumping off point if you're not so much into craft beer. With First Impressions, nice Hellstyle lager, very Germanic, and we went for a couple of sort of German Bavarian style hops. We don't tend to do a lot of those. We try to stick mainly to like American style because we're very much like a IPA West Coast style brewery. But First Impressions was I don't want to say a gamble, but it's a nice little branch out from our usual, and you might kind of get that as you have a little sip. Where, again, I don't know how familiar you are with our stuff, but it's very much sort of out there, not the kind of thing that we do a lot of. But I like to think we did a very good job because all of our beers are fantastic. Yes, it was. Speaking of like sort of events and stuff down at Tap Yard, like Oktoberfest, we've got a couple of things coming up on Christmas. Again, if anyone's local, definitely feel free to come on down. I'm pretty sure that within your boxes as well, or at least at the end, you'll receive an email for a discount code on our website as well. So we just love to get the word out, spread it out. We love doing sort of events like this. It's great, kind of keeps things a little more. You don't want it to be too dry online, so we want to make sure everyone's nice and well hydrated, as it were. But yes, 100%. If anyone has any questions, feel free to pop them in chat, and I'll be able to talk a little bit more. I appreciate it's a little hard to kind of gauge what everyone's thinking when I can't see you, but we do our best. Awesome. Thank you very much.
Sainsbury's now.
Yes, we are. So we're actually we're in Morrison's, Sainsbury's. I think the only sort of supermarket that we're not massive in at the moment is Tesco because they've got a couple of tricky kind of workarounds to get through, but we'll try and get them one day. But we do ship all over the country for our online store. We also send out beer pretty much, every day. We send it as far as Birmingham, a little bit further sometimes. And we do even ship a couple pallets internationally. So it's kind of it's getting nice and big for Siren. It's a good time for craft brewing.
Yeah, it really is.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, guys. Enjoy the beer.
A quick question, Rob, not to put you on the spot, but do you do non-alcoholic beers at all? Is that something that Siren are approaching at all?
So that's a bit of a tricky one because there is more demand for it these days. A lot of people, because I mean, drinking's always been a little bit tricky to kind of breach certain times. We do have a selection like in the tap yard, but unfortunately, we don't do any ourselves at the moment. It's a bit more of a kind of intricate process because it requires adjusting brewing at a certain level, and with the amount that we're trying to put out, it tax on a lot of extra time that we probably don't have. Not to mention the owner, he loves his high ABV, so I'm not sure that's really in his sort of mindset at the moment. But I mean, considering we managed to do the gluten-free beers like Pasta Pills and Lumina and Futurist, it may eventually be something that we dip our toes into, but probably a bit further down the line, I think.
No problem at all. No, I appreciate it, Rob. Thank you.
Thank you. No worries.
Okay, so in that case, what we'll do then, now that everyone's had the chance to have a quick beer, is we'll just dive into essentially how Varonis can help with these problems with collaboration that we've talked about previously. So let me just share my screen again. There we go. Just give me the thumbs up, Andy. Has that appeared okay?
Yep, it's all good.
Excellent. Okay, so let's talk about how we can help with these problems. And now, for those of you who aren't familiar with Varonis, Varonis is a data security platform that protects your data wherever you store it. I always like to say we're there to answer that question: who has access to your most sensitive and critical data? And that we provide a platform that essentially identifies data risks, more importantly, remediates them. Now, what sets us apart from a number of other vendors is that we focus on three main areas here that you'll see on screen: sensitivity, permissions, and activity. So the first thing that we always do within an organization is we classify the data that you have. So we do that across 365, we do that across on-prem, as well as many other platforms. And the first thing we're going to tell you is, where is that sensitive data? Where is that GDPR information or that regulated data, maybe intellectual property or financial information? Where does that exist? Where are the biggest repositories? And we're very used to finding information that organizations didn't even know that they had. But understanding that you have sensitive data alone isn't enough. The important thing is essentially, what are you going to do about having that sensitive data? Now you know where that is. So the next thing that we bring in is permissions. So we bring in all of those permissions from Active Directory or your identity provider. And that allows us to answer those key questions: who has access to your sensitive data? Who is actually accessing that sensitive data? And finally, who should be able to access that sensitive data? And what that allows us to do is work with you to allow you to enforce a model of least privilege, ensuring that only the right people can access the data that they need to, and the wrong people can't. So working towards that model of privilege and zero trust becomes very easy. But you'll notice the final thing there is the activity. And that's because we are monitoring every single file touch. If someone shares a file, we monitor it. If someone opens a file, deletes it, moves a file, we monitor that. And that allows us to very quickly determine what's normal for your users. And because we know what's normal, we can very quickly determine what's abnormal. So if we suddenly see a user that's taking a keen interest in very sensitive data that they never have been before, and they're doing that maybe from a device that they haven't done that from before, it gives us the ability to identify that and act upon it, and make sure that we're detecting those insider threats, those potentially compromised accounts, very early in the threat chain. So by pulling these three things together, that's what allows you as a business to always have real-time visibility. What sensitive data do we have? What's going on with it? Is it overexposed? And it allows you to continually reduce your blast radius, essentially what the impact of an attack would be if you were to be compromised. And because we're monitoring that activity, we're constantly able to alert on abnormalities, suspicious and malicious behavior where things just aren't right, things that are indicative of malware, indicative of cyber attacks, and of course, indicative of rogue and insider threats as well. And like I mentioned earlier in the session, simplifying the compliance comes as essentially as a byproduct of this, because you are able to say to auditors, you're able to say as a business, We understand the data that we have. We're actively reducing our blast radius, making sure only the right people have access to it. We understand that data, and we're also actively monitoring it for threats as well. And that makes those compliance requirements so much easier, especially when you think about things like GDPR. Now, I think it's worth mentioning that we've talked a lot today about 365 and Teams and SharePoint and OneDrive. But everything that we have shown you today and everything I'm about to show you, we can do across multiple platforms. It's not just about Microsoft on-prem and Microsoft in the cloud. It's also about other locations where organizations commonly use data, or commonly store data. Things like Google Drive, Slack, for example, Salesforce, which is often a treasure trove of PI and customer data. We cover all of those platforms as well as numerous NAS storage devices, and we're constantly increasing that to make sure that we grow with our customer requirements. So we're monitoring that across all of those platforms. So if you see any particular platforms there that you're concerned about, it's something that we can cover. It's something we can help with very quickly. So before I just go into a couple of screenshots and show exactly how we can do this, just important to mention that Varonis is a leader in the data security space, and this has been pledged by Forrester. And in essence, you know, we've got very high profile customers in this space. The reason that our customers come to us is because we're very accurate in terms of what we can identify, but also we can do something about it. Not only can we tell you where that sensitive data is, we can tell you if there's risks surrounding it. Most importantly, we can remediate those risks for you. And something that allows our customers to sleep well at night is the fact that our team of proactive incident response engineers are also monitoring customer environments. So if they identify some strange data behavior, people doing things they don't usually do, or things indicative of an inside or external threat, they're able to identify that, they're able to investigate that, and they're able to phone you to say what they found and what you need to do very quickly in order to resolve that particular incident. Now, looking back to what we've discussed specifically about Microsoft Teams, but also in the wider space as well, in the Varonis platform, you will have instant visibility, firstly, about the amount of sensitive records that you hold as a business and how many files within your business have sensitive data within them. But what we're also able to do is break that down, tell you the different categories of data you have, whether that is financial, whether that is personal identifiable information, or whether it is GDPR. And very importantly, also understand out of that data you have, is any of that data overexposed? Do you have data exposed to anyone on the internet, to any external users? Is there any data that the entire organization can access that's sensitive when only the financial team should have access to it? And do we have any data that we didn't think we had that's actually regulated and potentially overexposed? And we can provide all of that information, that real-time visibility, so you always understand the sensitive data that you have within your within your infrastructure. Now, of course, when we tell you that there's a risk, it's important to be able to answer those questions very quickly. So very swiftly, you're able to drill down and say, okay, you're telling me that there's overexposed data. What is that? What is the breadth of that? How much data are we talking about? Who is it overexposed to? And as you can see here, we drilled down into both Windows on-prem and also SharePoint Online, where we can see that there's been data that's been shared to too many people internally. We can see the amount of sensitive data, the type of data, and the amount of records that's within there. And we can do the exact same thing for your on-prem environment as well, all in one console. And this is where you can quickly prioritize your efforts, knowing, for example, that this corporate NDA folder has 2,463 instances of sensitive data within it, and we can see the breakdown of data there. That is instantly something where you can say, okay, we know where we need to prioritize our efforts. If we're going to remediate this, that is where we need to focus on that first and foremost. So answering that question, are we at risk? And then how big is the risk is something that we can do incredibly quickly. Now, we talked earlier about when we're trying to work out who has access to a file in Teams, in SharePoint, or wherever that might be. With Microsoft, there are a tremendous amount of different consoles that you need to check, primarily just because the system isn't a privacy by design system. But with Varonis, we can see the entire folder tree, all of those folders, all of those sensitive files. We can understand how much sensitive data is within those, but most importantly, we can very quickly reveal who actually has access. And this is where we can tell you, firstly, who has access, the level of access they have, whether that's external access, whether that's internal access, but most importantly, whether they still need that access. Have they used that access in the last 6 months or the last year? Does this data still need to be exposed to those particular users? And again, it's something we do in one console, and we can answer all those questions in one single system. Now, of course, sensitive means different things to different organizations. And out of the box, we have numerous classification rules that cover all of the main standards, and we pride ourselves on the accuracy of these particular rules. So if we're looking for GDPR data for specific member states, we can find it. If we're looking for PCI data or financial information, or even if you need to create custom rules, we can put those in the system very quickly and identify what is sensitive to you. And having that accuracy just ensures that you know that we are detecting the right data, and we can assess the risk associated to that. Now, I talked earlier about how one of the things we do is track activity, and this is tremendously useful across all of the different platforms that we're monitoring. And I was saying about, if a user opens the file, if they delete a file, if they do anything along those lines, we will track that. And this is tremendously useful when you think about how threats can sometimes emerge within an organization. An example might be that somebody has tried to log in to your Azure infrastructure using an Azure AD compromised account, and they've done it from a weird geolocation that they don't usually come in from. Let's just say a user decides to log in from a particular country that they've never logged in from historically. That is an example of something that we would track. But if that user then copies a file from an on-premise Windows server and puts it in SharePoint, we will monitor that. If that user then decides to share that data to an external party outside of the organization, again, we would track that. So from start to finish, we're able, by monitoring Active Directory and by monitoring all your file systems, be able to do that start to finish. Who is accessing the sensitive data? How have they done that? What are they doing? And have they, what have they done? What files were involved? How sensitive they are. So that full audit trail is completely there. Now, I'm mindful at this point that I've been talking a lot about problems with sensitive data that organizations have, problems with overexposure. But the important thing about Varonis is the fact that we can remediate this automatically and at scale. So we've got numerous policies that work out of the box, firstly to remove overexposure of data, whether that be in 365, whether that be local on your Windows file servers. So just some examples of that would be removing collaboration links that are overexposing sensitive data, maybe overexposing sensitive data to everyone in the organization, or exposing data to people on the internet. We can get rid of those straight away. We can do that at scale. And what we can also do is remove stale collaboration links. So of course, users create collaboration links all the time, maybe sharing sensitive data to things like contractors. Of course, there comes a point where that share or that link is no longer required. So we can identify whether those links are being used, and we can automatically revoke them if they're no longer being used by those people. So all of those out-of-the-box rules exist there for you to very quickly automate these remediation actions. So you can actually say, yes, as an organization, we are actively monitoring data being shared outside of the organization by 365, and we have rules in place to revoke that. And that's something that we can do on a constant process, and we can also include approval mechanisms to ensure that we aren't making changes that the organization doesn't want. And just as a follow on from that, just to show the breadth of this, you can see how we can completely filter these particular results and train these particular policies to focus specifically on what you want, specific types of classification rules, specific locations, specific types of overexposure. We can home in on those and we can resolve them for you. And that's all out of the box from the Varonis platform. Now, one just last thing that I wanted to mention before we finish up on this session today is that I appreciate you've seen some screenshots. I appreciate you've seen examples of how we can help with sensitive data and help resolve those data risks that organizations have. But as a free of charge engagement, we offer data risk assessments of your environment. And these are no strings attached. Essentially, what this allows us to do is install the Varonis platform within your environment and actually allow you to see the risks that your particular environment faces with regards to data. So over a period of 2 weeks, we would install the system that would start analyzing and classifying the data. After a couple of days, we would start running data review sessions with you so you can identify straight away, and we can tell you what risks you have and what things we've identified. And at the end of the process, which is never more than 21 days, we do a full executive review of the risks found, what you can do about them if you use the Varonis platform. And it just gives you those insights as to the risks you have and how those can be remediated at scale very easily. So those data risk assessments, if this is something that you're interested in, please do let us know. We'd happily set those up. We'd love to understand what you want to achieve from a data governance point of view. Make sure we focus that data risk assessment on that particular area. And at the very least, at the end of that process, you've got a report that you can take back to the business and say, these are the risks we face. And know that you have a solution that you could invest in to resolve those problems should you want to. Now I'm just going to quickly ask Andy, was there anything that you wanted to add to that? Because I appreciate that i360 also kind of offers services in this area as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, also obviously Varonis is probably one of the best tools in the market in the area that it deals with. A tool isn't really worth anything unless you can actually use it properly, and it can be quite a steep learning curve. So if you want a tool that can actually help you deal with all these challenges, but you haven't got the time inside your team or the kind of skills inside your team, we can absolutely provide a managed service around Varonis and help you use your Varonis subscription to get the maximum value out of your purchase. I think with the DRAs are a particularly good no-brainer for anyone who's just considering it, even just to get a free report, because they are, I mean, the last one I did was just picture perfect for us, really, because it was for a fairly large insurance firm, and they were like, everything's on SaaS, so we don't really hold any data ourselves. But what they didn't realize was a lot of their customers were downloading SaaS reports to their OneDrive, which they were then sharing out to people. So although they thought they were protected because of the SaaS privacy security, when we actually run the DRA, and we had, by the way, not just the IT department, because their DPO function was held within the HR area, we had their DPO on there, we had the HR people on there, and the results of the DRA, the actual top file that was at the very top of the list of 1,000 files with the classification data that we were looking for, was a list of, it was a spreadsheet of all of their MasterCards. It was MasterCards names, it was numbers, it was credit, it was everything you could need at the very top of the list. And obviously they ended up sharing it. I mean, the good thing about the different people who would use it is, what we find with some companies is they will share the cost of it around different areas of the business. So IT team might use it, but actually some of the budget can be scraped back from other areas. It's just a consideration, I would say.
Brilliant, thank you, Andy. Yeah, and it's a good example. We speak to lots of organisations where there is a policy within the environment that HR data sits within a HR folder, finance data sits within there. But of course, when you bring things like OneDrive in, it's a very useful platform. It's a great collaborative platform, and it is not uncommon for us to find files that have just been put in somebody's personal OneDrive. Often they're in the finance team, and data may be shared out externally to a home email address. A lot of the time, it isn't necessarily malicious activity, but it's an example of data that is not in the location that it should be. It's vast amounts of sensitive data, and often it's overexposed. So those are the kind of answers that we can give you very quickly to understand, if there is data in the wrong places, if there is data overexposed, and we'd of course demonstrate how we could remediate that for you. Indeed, if you did want to use the platform moving forward. But with that, that's the end of the session that I was going to talk about today. So we do have some time for some Q&A. I can't remember, Andy, please remind me, are we going to go to another beer or are we going straight into questions and answers?
Yeah, look, let's have Rob do another beer. I'll share some of the kind of key takeaways, and then we can go straight to the Q&As. We've had quite a few questions come in.
Excellent.
Fantastic, guys. So I thought we'd finish up with a nice punchy one. Going to go for IPAs for Days, which was a this is a collaboration we did with Indie Hops Project, who sort of they kind of I don't want to say mess with hops, but they're just certain hops that quite popular to use today. For example, this one uses Idaho 7, which has been adjusted to give it a bit more punch. Same with Luminosa, which is one of their other popular ones. And when you taste it, you'll really be able to pick up that punchy hop taste. It's almost a little bit of hop burn on that one. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it can be a little bit overwhelming, especially after we sort of started off with a couple of lagers. But this is what Siren really goes for. We want to really push the boat out with as many hoppy profiles as possible. See what kind of flavors you can create. A lot of people get quite surprised, for example, if you do try Soundwave later on, that we don't use any fruit or anything. Like all of the flavor within there is just flavoring from hops that we've added into the brew. A lot of oils being released to create such a varying flavor set depending on what kind of malts you've used. Every part of the process creates such a different end flavor set. And yeah, it's just really interesting to experiment with hops that kind of have just released or have been adjusted, creating different flavors that you would never find elsewhere. For example, we used Talus recently in the past, which gives big grapefruit flavors, which is fantastic for one of our sour beers, Pompelmoncello. It's a grapefruit sour. And again, so many people are just like, there's no grapefruit juice in this. And no, it's all natural, as it were. It's all flavoring from hops. But yes, IPA for Days. I hope no one's got anything else to do this evening.
Just a quick question, Rob. I've always kind of wanted to ask this. What is the process of designing one of your beers? Like, do you come up with a concept for the flavour and then mix it to get that flavour? Or is it more, as I would probably do, just throw a lot of stuff together and kind of hope for the best and then come up with stuff line afterwards?
It tends to be a bit of the latter because so we've got like a fairly smallish brewing team. We've got about 6 brewers, 1 lead brewer and 1 head brewer, and everyone has their own little home kit that they'll create their own concepts on and see what they can come up with. For example, a lot of things just kind of accidentally made. I suppose that's not really the right way to say it, but someone will create something, be like, this tastes great, present it to the lead brewer, who will then check to make sure if it's viable for us to make in the long run. And then, goes up and up the chain until someone signs off on it. And it's going to be our new beer next week. It's how we basically release new beers pretty much every week, sometimes every 2 weeks, but always on a Friday. So there's always a lovely weekend to enjoy some extremely fresh beer from our brewery. We do occasionally go for a more traditional sense in we want to create a flavor style that's like this. How can we get that? And everyone mashes their heads together to see and their taste buds to see what kind of hops will create the flavor profiles that we need.
Yeah, that is, yeah. Cool. Thank you very much.
Cheers, man.
So there was a lot covered in that session. I think some of the key takeaways we should take back with ourselves are, I mean, as we said, we all knew this anyway, but maybe Andy has just made this even worse for us. But classifying sensitive data in the way that we're working at the moment and fixing the exposures we've got it's really hard. It's really hard. It's so dynamic. It's changing all the time. I mean, one of the examples that we kind of talked through with data's shared externally to the internet through Teams, that link is ultimately on somebody else's machine that can be accessed even without authenticating to your environment. So I mean that's terrifying, really, what could happen there. Data remediation efforts are difficult. You saw the steps that had to be gone through just for one team site and one sharing and a couple of people sharing. Now we've got something like, I think, 600 people in our organization, and I'm a member of about 57 teams, and I've got currently 27 unread messages in different channels, of which some file shares. You know, it's crazy. But we do need to do the job, and that's one of the problems again, is the subunits in there. Different people have different ways of dealing with data. I'm sharing documents left, right, and centre with kind of customers and prospects and my internal team and the tech team and support team, product owners. Then we've got the likes of Becky, who set up this call. You know, she's dealing with a lot more external people, and we do have to share this data. It's the only way we can do our business. Quantifying the data security posture in this environment is, it's hard. I mean, it's not just hard to do it as a point in time assessment, but be to continuously aware of it. The visibility that Rob was talking about towards the end of there, it's a really dynamic environment. It can change. Even we've got a document with classified data on, I can make a copy of that. All of a sudden, we've got 2 copies of it, and our exposure is just double. That data, that one document could have 19,000 records in. It's So we monitor data. So I come from a network security background, and I remember the kind of good old days of data center and DLP enforcement points, pinch points of data cannot traverse the network. Those days are gone. And really now, when we talk about kind of DLP, we're talking about probably endpoints, but that still needs to be classified and labeled correctly. But then some people should be allowed to use data. How do you spot what's not normal? Is it how they're doing it or the amount they're doing it? We had a good, well, I say a good, we had an episode with our incident response team recently where a CTO from a disgruntled company, upon handing his notice in, downloaded 700 gigabytes of data to a virtual machine, which he then subsequently wiped. Probably, I think, like 2 hours after that. And just because of the lack of records in their environment, we had no visibility at actually what happened with the data. We can tell what files were accessed, but where the data's gone, kind of nobody knows. And the problem is, if you imagine if the worst case happens and anyone was breached and we have to report to the ICO, the first question that is asked, and the one thing that everyone is asked, is what data was taken. Now, if you can't access that, the only thing you can assume is pretty much all data is taken, unless you can quantify it and say, with confidence, we know that these files were taken, then you'd have to assume all of it. And I think we kind of touched on the last point before, compliance audits and manual incomplete, but also more importantly, there are points in time. One of the big things we're pushing for, not just in the realm of data security, but in just security in general, is continuous threat exposure management. So that's data security and everything. We need to always know at what points in our environment can we be compromised? What is our risk profile? I think we'll move on to the Q&As. We've got quite a few to go through. So, Andy, I'll probably delegate some of these to you, and I'll take some of the ones that I can. That's all right for you?
Yeah, please do. Please do. Yeah, go ahead.
All right, Cole. This is one for you, and I know this is close to your heart from conversations we've had before. I've heard a lot about Microsoft Copilot and how this can really help productivity in Microsoft 365. Do the risks that you've mentioned in this presentation have any impact on the imminent release of Copilot?
That is a really good question, and it's almost as if it's a plant question, because no, you're completely right. It does have a massive impact on Copilot. So for those on the call that aren't familiar with what Copilot is, this is essentially Microsoft's AI system that lives within Microsoft 365. And the idea behind it is to really maximize productivity. So you can kind of think of an example where someone in the finance team might say, you know, build me a financial report of all of the company's earnings in the last 3 years, for example. And the idea of Copilot is it can go off and it's that generative AI where it can create that information and build that report for you. The problem with Copilot is it's completely dependent on the permissions of that user. And as we've seen through this whole process, often there are way too over permissive permissions in place. And that means that, if somebody, anyone in the organization, even maybe just a standard user, asks that same question, if they've got access to that data via permissions, Copilot is going to say, well, this is fair game. This is something that I can use in order to fulfill this AI request. So having a handle on permissions is vital with regards to Microsoft Copilot. And in fact, there was a recent release by Microsoft where they have said, use organizations like Varonis in order to answer these questions, just simply because, their solution can't provide that in terms of the native tools. So if you are considering Copilot, again, feel free to do a data risk assessment with us, because not only will we be able to tell you just general data risks, we can very clearly point out which ones would be a big problem for Copilot as well. So yeah, the Copilot very heavily affected by the impact of these permissions.
Okay, and we've got a couple of competitor questions here. That's all right.
Okay. Yeah, go for it, please.
Talk about how would you compare yourselves and your capability compared to basically ShareGate and Microsoft Purview?
Okay, so yeah, so two very different solutions in that respect. So ShareGate tends to, their kind of main focus is migrating data. So migrating data from on-prem, migrating data from kind of like on-premise historic teams, all that kind of thing, and moving that into the cloud. Now, they do have the ability to edit permissions and do certain things surrounding permissions, but it's not based on context such as who's actually using the data, if the data is sensitive, those kind of things. So ShareGate, what they do from a migration point of view is, very effective, but it's not kind of like for like in terms of they play in a different space, to Varonis in that respect. So yeah, ShareGate's more on the permission side. They're not there to track data usage on sensitive data, identify anomalies, actively determine data risks and overexposure, nor fix it. So yeah, ShareGate kind of are in their own space in terms of what they do from a migration perspective. Purview is an interesting one because, as I'm sure you would expect, Purview is available to Microsoft customers. It's considered a native tool. So every one of our customers that use or monitor 365 do have the ability to use Purview as well. But the difficulty with Purview is kind of very similar to what we've seen, is the fact that there's so many different consoles in order to determine things. It would be one console to understand auditing, another one to understand classification, and then auditing not involving classification, or when trying to run a report to see if you've got collaboration links, not being able to understand if any of those house sensitive data. So there's just no joined up message there. The other problem is just a lack of focus on permissions and remediation. So Purview might be able to say, you've got a load of sensitive data. They're not going to be able to tell you accurately what the sensitive data is, in what volumes, and they're not going to be able to fix it without a tremendous amount of manual PowerShelling and all of those bits and pieces. So again, this is not me trying to beat up the competition, just from our customers that have used Purview and then come over to us. The story is often the same. They tried to implement a certain project, but there's just not been the tools to allow them to do that. And, after a certain amount of years, they've just decided, we can't enforce this. And of course, Varonis can answer those questions and actually remediate very quickly. So those are kind of the main things we do there. Again, if Purview is something that you're looking at, please, come to us. We'd happily do a data risk assessment. We'll show you how quickly we can identify and resolve these issues. And that's a great way of showing the value of the solution.
And probably a nice segue to, we've got one of the questions: what does setting up a DRA involve, and how long does it take? Or Andy kind of covered this earlier. So in essence, really, it depends what data stores you want to look at and what classifications you're kind of looking for. I mean, we typically do GDPR and PII data as the kind of the mark that we're looking for. And if you're doing something like a traditional data store or SharePoint, for instance, then it's probably to get one set up requires spinning up a VM, and then we're talking probably about an hour, 2 hours time to actually get that in and configured, is my experience. It needs some time to actually then go and scrape all the data and kind of walk through all the data. So we usually leave it for probably 3 days to a week, generally, depending on the size. And then we can kind of run through the reports. And what we would look to do is present the reports back to you, give you a document detailing the kind of limited findings of it. I think it's really good, actually, if you want to go to the Varonis website and just put in DRO assessment, you can get example reports of what you can expect from it. I think they're really helpful, but they are one of the most powerful budget enablers you would get. And I always encourage people to, when that presentation is spun back to you, get everyone on there who is concerned about data, because it might be coming from your budget, but the HR will be very interested in it. Your DPO will be interested. Your CIO should be kind of all over it. There are a lot of heads in the business, typically outside of the IT department, who are really interested in the contents of this report and will probably be quite shocked by the contents. So a quick look. We've got a couple of ones about recording. We are going to send the recording link out after the session. Quick on here, can Varonis apply classification labels onto on-premise and cloud data?
It can indeed. Yeah. So if you're a business that's using Microsoft Information Protection or AIP, we can actually import those labels into the Varonis system and apply them based on classification that we've done. So you might have a label that says, that's called internal sensitive, and you may choose to say, well, anything that Varonis identifies as GDPR data, tag that with, label that with that Microsoft label as, internal only. And we can do that both for 365, but also for on-premise files as well.
We've got one here, Rob, sorry, Andy. I keep calling you Rob.
No problem.
Do we have to drink all of the beer by the end of the session? You've marked that. You would like to answer that live.
I mean, it's not necessarily recommended, but if you don't have anything going on this evening, and you're feeling brave, I would 100% attempt it. But, they're great beers. Nice to be savoured and enjoyed.
We had one question there that I think has just disappeared. Let's see if it... What risks are involved with data risk assessment?
I guess the only risk is, and I hear this from organizations all the time, that you find something that it's really important that you do something about. that's the risk. But no, I mean, in terms of, sorry, Andy, you go on if you had something to add.
No, I mean, it's the most common objection I get personally when we're talking about data risk assessment is CISOs turning around saying, I really don't want to turn over that stone, because we haven't got the manpower to remediate what we find. If we don't know what we don't know, I feel more comfortable than knowing it's pardon my words, a shit show over here, but I haven't got time to remediate it. And I think that's fine. I think that's valid, and that's the same for any kind of vulnerability management or exposure management kind of tool. And again, the answer to that really is, you can get a managed service wrap around it. So all you need to do is make decisions and let kind of trained engineers do the heavy lifting for you.
Yeah, and I guess just to reiterate the point with regards to that, in terms of installation, very quick, no more than 90 minutes. And then it is just the only involvement from you, or the only cost of the business is just the time for us to have a couple of sessions with you to run through our findings and do that final executive review. And that's where all of those risks will be shown to you. Of course, we can talk about next steps and all of those bits and pieces. But yeah, that will give you the insight to the risks that face your organization across your different data repositories.
Right, I think that is all of them.
Marvelous. Excellent. Well, so if there's any more questions, put them in the. Were there any more beers you wanted to run through, Rob, or have you finished your your different ones?
I mean, we've got the 3 more, but I don't want to take up anyone's time too much. I do have to start my shift in 5 minutes as well, so I'm not sure how much I can
Well,
drink.
get a few in before that starts. Brilliant.
That's true. But yeah, happy to answer any more questions anyone has. But yeah.
Fair enough. So I think maybe then, if Bexy, maybe we call it a day. There's no more questions that have come in. See how many attendees. Still got 22 people on the call. Last shouts for any more questions. No, I don't think so. Right, okay, we'll call it a day then, guys, I think. Thank you so much for your time in joining this. We'll be running a few more of these sessions, so keep an eye out from your account manager. And if you think of any questions kind of post-haste, you can always feel free to email us, email the account manager, and we will follow up with links with the recording once it's ready.
Brilliant. So there's so
Looks
much.
like you've got a couple of questions popping in.
Oh, no, we have. I've got
So
so
I
much.
just didn't want to say thank you.
No, thank you guys for taking the time. I know the offer of free beer always helps.
Yeah. Thank you guys for having